Do you know which game in baseball history has the records for the most doubles? I'll spoil the answer. It came on July 12, 1931, Cubs and the Cardinals. The two rivals played a doubleheader at Sportsman's Park that day. The Cubs won the first game 7-5. The Cardinals came back to win the second game 17-13. This was a baseball game, not a football game. That game featured 23 doubles, most of which were ground rule doubles. 23 doubles. Let that sink in. 23. 45,715 fans entered Sportsman's Park that day. But actually, if you dig in, you'll learn that the attendance was well more than that. I mean, there were lifetime passes, season passes, there were kids sneaking into the game, there was Ladies' Day, there are all sorts of ways that people attended baseball games for cheap or even for free back in those days, and we usually forget about that. Note also that Sportsman's Park seated about 34,400, give or take. In other words, almost 12,000 fans, nearly a third of the crowd, were standing. Most of those fans ringed the outfield during the opening game. However, due in part to poor police presence, many of those fans made their way for the grandstands near the infield and would not move. It got to the point where a ball hit over the third baseman's head was going to bounce into the crowd as a ground rule double no matter what. There have been other overflow crowds, sure, but there never was a crowd quite like this one. The game was a delight for those who love big offense. Ripper Collins and Gus Mancuso led the way for the Cardinals with 3 doubles each. It was a classic game from the days of slugging. But the biggest question here is not what, but why. Why were there so many fans there? What's the story behind that? And really, that's where this becomes really interesting. As you know, the country was in the depths of the Great Depression back in 1931. Now that's what makes this so strange. Why would so many people attend baseball games back when we know that there really wasn't enough money to cover basic necessities? Well, and it's not like people had no other choices for their leisure time either. This is something that people often exaggerate, by the way. Baseball was not the only activity you could participate in. Radio was huge, for example, and of course, you could listen to radio stations for free as long as you had a receiver. Now, St. Louis wasn't alone in drawing big crowds either. A Cardinals-Cubs doubleheader just 1 week earlier at Wrigley Field attracted another crowd of 45,000, and that was on a Tuesday. Okay, let's dig in a little bit. I mean, maybe there was a great pennant race going on at the time. Sort of. The Cubs were 5.5 games out of first place on July 7th. That's the day that Wrigley drew 45,000. Reports indicated that hundreds more fans stood on rooftops and by windows across Wayland Avenue watching the game for free. The other interesting thing to note here is that this doubleheader was actually broadcast live on the radio. That's right, WGN broadcast this doubleheader live as it happened. So what's the deal with the big crowd? Now, one of the things that we forget about this era of baseball history is that there was a lot of controversy over whether you should broadcast games on the radio, whether that would cause people to not show up for free, all sorts of stuff like that. So it's interesting to note that the Cubs doubleheader at Wrigley Field was broadcast locally and still resulted in a huge overflow crowd, one that was one of the biggest in the history of Wrigley Field. Meanwhile, the Cardinals doubleheader, the one with all those ground rule doubles, that one was not broadcast locally. Instead, the St. Louis stations broadcast a road game between the St. Louis Browns and the Detroit Tigers, one that drew a crowd of about 3,000. So there's a chance that radio actually helped crowds instead of hurt them. This is back when baseball teams didn't fully appreciate the power that radio had to promote their product. The fear was that fans would stay home and listen to the game rather than going to the ballpark to see it, thereby hurting gate receipts. Well, it's easy for us to look back at the past and conclude that all those people back then were just ignorant. Well, that's easy, that is, until you realize that we're running into the same problem today. We talked about this problem before, you remember this. How many more people do you think would be interested in their local team if they could follow them for free? How much more interest would there be in the sport if people knew who the players were? Okay, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Sports broadcasting is by far the best advertising medium you can possibly have. People are not going to care about your teams unless they care about the players. And of course, they won't care about your sport if they don't care about the teams. People won't care about those players unless you give them a reason to care about them. You have to be engaging. You can't just play a game, expect people to show up, and then berate them when they don't show up. And, well, that's exactly what baseball owners have been doing for decades. There's a huge market out there for online sports streams. People want to see what happens, especially when a local team is involved. And, well, people will pirate those streams if they're not readily available. Now, if you were to offer a stream for really cheap, or shockingly enough, for free, you would attract a huge crowd. That's something that advertisers are always interested in. That's what happened in the end with baseball on the radio. It took decades, but teams eventually learned that advertisers were a better source of income than gate receipts alone. The funny thing is that baseball teams take radio broadcasts for granted today. That makes sense, of course. It's not quite as attractive and exciting as it was in the early 1930s. You see, the lesson that baseball learned, or the lesson baseball should have learned from the 1930s, is that advertisers pay big money for a captive audience. It's the same lesson that people learn today. YouTube creators, bloggers, podcasters, and so on. We all learn that the more engaging you are, the bigger an audience you attract. And the bigger an audience you attract, the more that advertisers are willing to pay. It's not really that hard to understand. The part that's hard to understand is the constant insistence on territorial rights. It is cutting off your nose to spite your face. You're so focused on a small stream of income that you ignore the huge potential stream staring you right in the face. Alright, now we don't have the crowd control issues today that the Cubs and Cardinals had back in the 1930s. We don't have those issues in part because those who want to watch the game can watch it. They don't all have to go storm the stadium. You could buy tickets in advance back in the 1930s just as you can today, but there was one key difference. Back in the 1930s, most stadiums were filled with what they called general admission seating. General admission seating was as opposed to reserve seating. Reserve seating is where a certain seat is designated as yours. That's how all seats are sold today. The old model, however, allowed for a little bit of creativity and wiggle room. We don't talk much about general admission tickets today, mostly because they're a thing of the past. For example, in Great Britain, the old stands, and I'm talking about the old pens of standing people in huge sections of the stadiums, those were taken away in the early 1990s. This, of course, was a direct result of the famous Hillsborough disaster and the subsequent Taylor Report. We've never had anything like that in American sport, but we've had the same push towards reserve seating only. Alright, I remember going to BYU football games with my dad back in the early 1990s. We had season tickets for something like 6 or 7 years in a row. We sat on old metal bleachers. They were way up near the top of the stadium. Now, if you attend today, even if you sit in the same part of the stadium, you'll notice that all of those old bleachers are gone. The old style bleachers are what general admission seating once was. The death of general admission seating is the biggest difference between the fan experience in the old days and the fan experience today. Somebody asked me here the other day what the biggest difference was between being a fan back then and being a fan now. Well, back in the old days, you had to rely on newspapers for your information, which wasn't great. However, general admission seating was great. You could sit more or less where you wanted, provided of course that you could afford a ticket and that you could take the time off to watch. And come to think of it, maybe that's what the biggest difference was in 1931. Because of the Depression, fans had time to swarm the ballpark for a doubleheader. But you know, I feel like there's something more. It feels like baseball was just more accessible and more prominent back in those days. I mean, they had Babe Ruth, for crying out loud. Everybody knew who Babe Ruth was. Everybody today knows who Babe Ruth was. And you know, that might be the biggest source of baseball's current popularity problem. Publicity and human interest stories work. I'll tell you a story about this. I was 12 years old back in the summer of 1996. I remember the Olympic Games that summer like it was yesterday. I particularly remember the U.S. women's gymnastics team. You probably remember them too. Shannon Miller, Dominique Moceanu, Dominique Dawes. The so-called Magnificent Seven were household names that summer. And so, when Carrie Strug pulled off the impossible, many of us who didn't even understand the sport were cheering. Okay, I don't watch gymnastics. Whatever interest I had in the sport ended as soon as the 1996 Olympic Games ended. But I still remember the names and I still remember the excitement. That's how powerful the human side of sport can be. Now, I don't know for sure that the Cubs and Cardinals had good publicity to thank them for drawing those huge crowds in 1931. However, I do know that baseball hasn't had a real superstar for quite a few years now. And, well, maybe that's what the game is missing.